Hello and welcome to the AI Pathfinder for Private Equity podcast. I'm on a mission to lead private equity from AI bewilderment to AI empowerment. And I'm doing that by building a dedicated network that will, piece by piece, create a playbook for successful AI adoption across private equity operations, origination and value creation. I'm meeting and having very interesting conversations with people within PE and across the AI value chain. I'm very pleased to bring some of these to life through this podcast. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that could make or break an AI project or even a company: ethical AI and AI governance. This is going to be hard to keep to 30 minutes, but our mission is to help you understand this complex area and give you some guidance. I know my special guest is up for the challenge. I'm very pleased to welcome Pauline Nissen, ethical AI lead at ML6. Hello, Pauline. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you also for inviting me.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's really good to have you here. And we had a conversation, a couple of weeks ago, and it's a really fascinating subject. And yes, we could be talking about this for some time, but for today, we're trying to stick to that 30-minute. Well, look, first of all, perhaps you could just give us a brief view on yourself and on ML6, and then we can get a bit more into the ethical AI side of things.
Yes, so I'm working at ML6 as the ethical AI lead. So ML6, it's an AI company. We are building AI custom solutions for our clients. So our clients are from different industries: insurance, manufacturing, retail, e-commerce, and so on. And based on what they want, based on the problem, we can build a custom AI solutions. And I'm also working there as the ethical AI lead. So mainly working on internal and external awareness about ethical AI. So making sure that the solutions that we are building for clients are responsible, ethical, but also, for example, legal, compliant with the AI Act, which is coming. And then externally, also doing some awareness about ethics, sharing best practice via events, blog posts, and also this podcast, for example.
Well, yes, that's a really good bit of context there, and it feels like we're going to get to the point where we're probably going to see more of you in other companies. But I suppose the first question is why now? What led ML6 to hire you as an ethical AI lead?
Yes, so I think it started 3 years ago. So we created the ethical AI unit. So it's a cross-team unit. So it's a unit of people working from different units. For example, ML engineers, salespeople, people from HR. And I think the idea was, why do we need an ethical AI unit at MS6? Is because we realized that AI was not just experimenting. It was really building AI solutions with an impact on society, with an impact on humans. And I think at that point in time, we decided, okay, do we want to build anything with AI? Or do we want to make a choice in what we want to build and what we don't want to build? So that's why we created this ethical AI unit. An example of what we created back then is like our red lines. So it's a couple of rules of red lines of project that we don't want to build. An example could be like if a client is asking us, I'm willing to improve weapons with AI. This is, for example, a red line, so something that we don't want to do, because we really believe in using AI for the good for the society and really preventing harm to the society. So I think that's the first part, like why do we want to have an ethical AI unit? To make sure that we build the right thing for the society. But ethics, it's also not so white and black. Most of the time it's gray. Ethics is also something very personal. So that's why we have in this unit a sounding board. So what's the goal of the sounding board is to have a kind of a discussion in a group. Let's say, for example, we have a new project. So a client is asking us, we want to build something, but it's not very... not very sure if it's really something with with a positive impact on the society. Then we have this sounding board. So we are discussing in a group about what are the advantages, what's the negative impact, for example, of building this AI solution. And we ask ourselves, are we okay with ML6 building this solution? An example, it's very sometimes difficult, but I think it's great to have those kind of discussions, and also making sure that employees are behind the idea of willing to build this use case. And sometimes what we have, a typical example is tobacco industry. Tobacco industry, you could say it's a very negative industry, but sometimes some of the AI projects that we could build there can have a positive impact. An example could be detecting defects on packaging of cigars and reducing the waste of this packaging. So that's something that's a use case with a positive impact, but maybe in a negative industry. And again, it's something very personal. So someone else will say maybe tobacco, it's okay. I'm fine with that. But yeah, defense, military sector is a no-go for me. So that's why we have those kind of discussions. So I think it's really important to know making time and not going too fast and really thinking what are we going to build with AI. So that's why. And also we have an internal rule stating that if your personal ethics, your personal value is more than the ethical value of MS6, if you don't want to work on a certain project because you think, for example, that the reputation of the company is not so ethical, then you can decide, like, we are very open and it's not a problem for you to not work on that project. And I think that's also one of the main reasons, the ethical part of ML6, that people are also joining ML6. I think it's something new in a lot of AI companies, that we make time and we are not going too fast to make the right decisions.
Yeah, so it's not just down to policies, it's down to culture, and
Yes.
that's got to come right down from the founders or the leaders within the business.
Indeed. It's really something that it's also important, I think, that it's aligned with the management and the strategy of the company. And that's also something, we have buy-in from the management. So it's not like we are really working together. So that's also important.
Yeah. Okay. So first and foremost, it came about because, the culture and what you were wanting to build as a business within the values, being really clear about, these are the projects we do, or these are projects we don't, or if there's a grey area, we have a really considered discussion about it. But I believe that's developed into now supporting your clients with those sorts of decisions as well, or certainly for them to be clearer on what they can and can't do, or where there's no laws is where you should probably consider there might be laws in the future, etc.
Yeah. So indeed that's internally, but of course we are very open and transparent also towards the clients. So sometimes they have also an AI use case, a project that they want to build, and the project is fine from an ethics perspective. But then if we look into, for example, the data, we see that a typical example is that the data is not representative. So the use case is good, but so to build an AI solutions, you need to train your AI models, you need to give examples of previous decisions. And sometimes what you see is that the data that they have are not representative of the situation that they want to analyze. And this could be a problem if the AI system that they use will have an impact on humans, on the society. Because the typical example is like if you want to detect fraud and you take previous decisions and you see in your data sets that many of the decisions were about women and less about men, for example, then the AI model could predict in the future that there is a pattern between the gender and the chains of fraud, which is probably not the case. And also then you can ask yourself, is it something that we want to include in the training data? Is it a pattern? So those are the kind of ethical decisions and considerations that we discuss openly with the clients to make the right decision with them.
Yeah, we'll go into those in a little bit more detail in a moment. I suppose just to sort of kick things off for our listeners, what's the worst case scenario? If we're not following, I mean, okay, we've got the scenarios that, building towards a weaponry or things like that, but generally the listeners are going to be not in that field, but they've still got to be really mindful. We've gone through the process of GDPR and being more sensitive to personal information. So what, in this situation, what do you think the worst case scenario is if you're not really tracking and following a more ethical or have governance in place?
Yes, I think it's actually broader than just ethics. So indeed legal.
Yeah.
I think the worst case scenario is like building an AI solution without what I call AI governance or risk management process. So it's a kind of a process that you have in your development phase of your AI solutions to really identify and mitigate risk. And the worst case scenario is that you're building an AI solution too fast because you want to release it to the public as soon as possible. And you don't take enough time to identify those risks and having mitigation actions to make sure that they are not have a big impact in final solution. I think that's the worst case scenario, because at the end it can have an impact, negative impact on humans, and then it's too late. Then it has already had an impact. And if you could have predicted that there is a risk, I think that's something really important for the future of AI to have like those kind of risk management process in place, making the time before just jumping and releasing it to the public. Because we saw a lot of examples, and I think the problem is not only from ethics. I think the problem could also be like reputation damage. Like if an organization is releasing it too soon with a lot of risk, we saw a lot of examples such as I'm going to call it a DPD or Air Canada. Air Canada, they built a chatbot to provide advice to the passengers about flight information. But at the end, it gave bad advice to the passenger. And Air Canada say it's not our fault, it's the responsibility of the chatbot. So that's something that you could have prevented with the guardrails. And that's something that the fact that there is no one accountable for a mistake of the chatbot, that's something that you could have predicted. So, and I think indeed worst case scenario for a company is also, and the impact on the reputation and on the user trust.
Yeah. And you mentioned, or we've obviously mentioned ethical here, and you touched on legal, but in the sort of, well, the three buckets that you mentioned before to me were ethical, legal, and security as well. So there's actually building an LLM, for example, but is actually just the utilization of an LLM within your employee group as well. So security is a big in this sense.
Yes. So when I'm talking about risk management process, I'm really talking about ethics, legal, and security. And security is also a big topic. And that's also something that we also look into it before we release, because data breach can happen, prompt injection with GenAI applications can happen. So that's something also that we test before we release the application. And from an ethical perspective, what we look at is like fairness. Are we favoring a certain group over another? Transparency, is it clear for the user that why we are making a certain decision? Oversights, because sometimes you forget, but not everything can be automated. Sometimes you also need to have like a human review, what we call it a human in the loop, to check the results before it's released to the user. We also look at society and environment. You just mentioned using LLMs. I think indeed with the generative AI, it's also a big topic, like making sure you can reduce the impact of LLMs on the environment. So, for example, using a smaller LLM if it's not necessary to have the latest version. So those are also the kind of things that we look at, because ethics is very broad. And then legal, of course, I think GDPR, but now also the AI Act, the EU AI Act is also a very big topic.
Well, look, let's talk about that then. I mean, you've talked about pretty much self-governance, but you've got good knowledge of the EU AI Act, and that's coming into force. Is it next, not 2 years? Is that right?
Yes, August 2026.
Yeah. So how is that looking to control AI's use then?
I think it's going to have a very big impact on a lot of companies using or building AI solutions. And also maybe not only for the companies in Europe, but also for like companies in the UK or in America and the rest of the world offering products to the European market. So because it's also applicable to them. And what's the EU AI Act? Basically, it uses a risk-based approach. So it defines categories of AI use cases. And for example, the first one is the unacceptable risks. So you could have an AI system, for example, to recognize emotions at a workplace or during a classroom at school, for example. And this is something that is so unacceptable because there is some privacy. I mean, having a camera looking at your emotions, it's maybe a bit weird. But also there is no scientific evidence of AI being able to detect the right emotions. I think it's also, it really depends on the culture as well. So minorities could be discriminated by those systems. So that's why those systems, so there is a list of systems which are unacceptable, which are prohibited. So as soon as next year in February, those AI systems will be prohibited. So you are not allowed to develop it anymore. Then you have the high risk. And I think unacceptable risk are like obvious. I think most of the time you're not developing those kind of AI systems. And the high risk are more tricky because I think they can deliver value, but they are high risk. So there are some risks. So for example, it's like tools using in recruitment. There can be a discrimination issue and so on. So that's why it's allowed under the AI Act to develop those tools. but you need to be compliant with a lot of obligations. And the high risk is really obligations like having technical documentation, conducting a risk analysis before. So it's a lot of obligations. We should not underestimate it. Then you have the transparency risk, basically generative AI project. So if you're building a chatbot, your chatbot is probably a transparency risk. What you need to do there, it's less extensive than high-risk AI systems, but what you need to do there is disclose transparency. So for example, if your users are using or interacting with a chatbot, having those kind of disclaimer to say like, hey, now you're interacting with an AI system, not with a human. And then finally, you have the no risk. And I think sometimes we also forget that the no risk are also, they have some, but it's, for example, a computer vision solution detecting defects on packaging in manufacturing and setup. So those don't have very high risk for the society, for the humans. So that's why it's there is no obligation there. And as you mentioned, so the AI Act will be applicable in 2 years with certain obligation. As I mentioned, the prohibited use case will be in February of next year. So the companies really have the time to prepare. And it's going to be progressive as well, because not everything is clear at this moment in the law. So we need more guidelines to make sure how can we implement it. But what I really think it's interesting with the AI Act is if you look at the obligations, it's really based on ethical AI principles. One of the obligations is to increase transparency, or as I just mentioned, like informing users about the use of AI. So this is something really important from an ethical perspective, making sure that the user are informed.
It comes across, as you talk it through there, as fairly logical. I think that immediately there could be concerns that it could suppress innovation. And obviously from a UK perspective, I'm not sure we've got any, it's very loose anyway in terms of what we're potentially going to have. And, that I suppose the thoughts around that is that, well, we're going to innovate faster. But as you say, if you're a business that's going beyond these borders, you're going to have to consider all of these factors, which are factors that should really be in your thinking. Who in an organization, so an organization that's looking to AI to develop, it might be an internal tools, it might be that they're developing a product to use externally. Who's looking at this? Is there a particular role that this lands on their desk, or should it be everyone's responsibility to become familiar?
That's a great question, because I think a lot of organizations, they know about the AI Act, but they don't know in the organization, they're also looking who should be responsible for it. I think a lot of DPOs at this moment are being asked, because they implemented the GDPR, and it feels like it's the same kind of law. I think a lot of DPOs are asked to indeed take on that role, to implement the AI Act also. But what we should not underestimate with DPO is also that you need AI skills, AI knowledge. I think for one of the obligations I just mentioned is also conducting a risk analysis. Risks, it's not only about personal data such as GDPR, it's also about, for example, generating harmful content. It's also about the problem of hallucination with LLM, so that you are not sure that the answer that you receive is actually correct. So those are risks, I think, that you really need to understand how AI is working before being able to identify and mitigate those risks. So I think a lot of DPOs are being asked, and probably in the future they will have like a DPO and maybe an Act implementer or AI governance lead. But I think it's also something that it's broader than just one person. Because as I mentioned, like one of the obligations is also writing technical documentation. Yeah, it's not something that the DPO is going to do. So that's maybe an ML engineer, a data scientist working on an AI project, which will also need to be aware of the implications of the AI Act. So it's broader in the company. It's just not one person.
Yeah, and absolutely that it's got to be company-wide adoption, hasn't there? And that goes with having some AI principles attached to the values that leadership are on board, is that everybody's understands. And we're talking about AI knowledge, that's going to have to really be across the organization, especially if it's an organization that wants to embrace this emerging technology as well. Let's move on to, I suppose, some more direct advice for private equity. Now, they're in a interesting position, because obviously they're thinking about themselves as a firm and how they might apply AI. but they're also buying businesses that are going to have potentially AI within it, either as a product or something that they've got, again. And they've also got a portfolio, so they could have 20, 30 plus companies with differing levels of adoption. I mean, that's a pretty big task, isn't it? Now, it's not on them to be day-to-day thinking about how those companies are using AI, but they're liable to some degree in terms of custodians of those businesses. Look, I know you're not a private equity expert, but what sort of advice would you give them around this sort of, I suppose, interesting puzzle that they may have ahead of them?
I think what's interesting to look into is like, if indeed it's to invest in a company building an external or internal AI solution, I think it's really important to consider their approach to ethical and legal AI. So we just talked about the AI Act, and we just mentioned, okay, the AI Act, it's still have 2 years to be compliant. So maybe it's too early to say like, if the company is compliant with the AI Act, it's fine. I think if it's already compliant, it's a really green flag. I think it's a very proactive approach. So that's interesting. But I think so at this moment in time, because it's too early to say like, if the company is compliant with the AI Act, then you should invest into. I think it's more looking into the mindset related to, are they willing to become compliant with the AI Act? Are they willing to build responsible AI solutions? Because I've heard some organizations stating that indeed, because of like it's kind of a blocker for innovation. AI Act, it's also for the whole of Europe, for small and large organizations. So I mean, if I am a small startup, nobody is going to look at my AI system to say so. So I think that's really for me a big red flag. You should have at least the mindset to try to look, how is the AI Act going to impact my organization? Do we have a plan? Do we want to hire someone to look into this? So I think that's really important to have that mindset, because you can see it from a compliance point of view, but I think it's not just about compliance. It's also about the reputation of your organization. As I just mentioned, for example, Air Canada, I think because of the problems that they have had with their chatbots, it's also impacting the reputation. And maybe you don't trust the company anymore in the way they handle. And then it's not only about reputation, because this is maybe the negative approach, but the positive approach could be, if you want to invest in responsible AI, you can also improve the user trust. I think it's really responsible AI and legal AI could also be an USP for a lot of companies, because the articles that you see in the media about the risk of AI, those are the same articles that your clients or user are going to read. And if you can reassure them that you're taking the right step, I think you can really increase this trust of your users in the product. So I would really advise to look into the mindset, is responsible AI and legal AI important for the company before investing in it?
Yeah, that's good advice there. In terms of them thinking about their portfolio, I know that many of them are assessing how, I suppose, their foundations for not just adopting but building out AI within their businesses, seeing which industries, verticals are going to have more opportunities or threats against them. So there's a lot of work going on to try and better understand the landscape. But in terms of, I'm not sure there's a lot going into thinking about, ethical, legal, security necessarily around AI. So, if you've got 30 companies within your portfolio, what advice would you give in terms of, as a PE firm, would you set up, perhaps you were talking earlier about the discussions that you have as a team, should this be something that a PE firm should have a central point around learning about AI governance, ethical AI, those aspects? Just, this is brainstorming a little bit, but just thinking, how could they support their portfolio making the right decisions here?
As I just mentioned, it's also important to have buying from the management, from investors. So I think it's also important to promote that. So if it's not something AI governance, or as I just mentioned, something board that we have at ML6, if it's not something that is already in place, to at least start with responsible AI culture. So promoting that it's something important that we want to invest into, that we want to be recognized as a top leader, for example, in the market. I think that's the first step, building a culture of responsible AI. Next step are processes, having those kind of structured processes in your organization. But what we often forget about processes, for example, you could say, okay, I'm going to have an AI policy in those organizations to make sure that we are using in the right way. But what we often forget is AI governance and using AI in the right way. It's all about people. It's all about change management. You really need first to convince them of the why before having a very long AI policy, because otherwise no one is going to read it because they don't think it's important. So I think for me, that's the first step. Promoting from the management that responsible AI is important, having the right culture fit, and then it's going to start in the organization.
Great. Well, look, I think that often we want to look at other examples out there of people doing it well. Who's getting it right, in your opinion? Who can we look at in terms of best practice?
I just mentioned like reputation and user trust. I think and why investing in responsible AI can also be seen as a USP. I think a very good example, like Adobe. So I think 1 year ago, they released Firefly. So it's a GenAI tool. At that moment in the GenAI space, it was very difficult with copyrights. So a lot of photographers were really worried about their own image being used by other products. So, and I think what Adobe did really well, it's like being very transparent and very open to the users. Like they disclosed what kind of pictures they use, and they also gave the guarantee that it's either in the public space, either they have the rights to use those images as a training set for the GenAI model. So I think that's something that it's a good practice to inform your users and to reassure them that there is no copyright issue, for example, because then they have all the right information to make the right decision whether to use or not the tool. And that creates trust a lot more than other being like a black box and not disclosing their images, for example.
Yeah, it becomes, well, a USP, doesn't it, really? And if you're wanting to follow certain principles, then you need to be working with vendors and suppliers that share those principles. And I know that in terms of creating those principles, there's some good examples out there, even from those that are sort of the leaders, really, like Microsoft. They've got some principles there that are probably worth having a look at, as do Google and others. So I think that there's some good examples out there. No excuse, I suppose, to create a first draft to get the ball moving. We're coming near to the end now. I suppose that we're getting bombarded by lots of ideas to utilize AI, new tools every day, developments in the software. But when it comes to ethical AI and how that's going to progress, obviously we've got the EU Act, but others may follow in other countries. How do you stay on track with this? Is there a source that we should be?
I think it's kind of funny because I think like in the AI space, there is a very open community about AI, and it's also the case about ethical AI. So for example, there is a very large community of experts on the AI Act, AI governance, ethical AI on LinkedIn. I mean, there are a lot of experts, companies sharing their best practice very openly, like, hey, we did this in our AI solutions, and we are just sharing the learnings. Or you also have academics sharing a new paper, recent discovery about ethical AI. So that's something that I really like, is like just sometimes scrolling on LinkedIn, you learn so many things of people just sharing openly their discoveries. And maybe if I can give two important resources for people interested to look into ethical AI, the first one would be the assessment list for trustworthy AI. So trustworthy AI, responsible AI, it's all the same. It's a checklist that has been released by the European Commission. And it's a very interesting list because they have a lot of standard questions that you can ask yourself when you're building an AI solution. For example, did you assess the impact of your AI solution on humans, on the society? So I think it's very, very interesting document to have a look at, to really try to understand the ethical implications of an AI system. And then the next example, the second resource that I could share is also like a database, which is called incidentdatabase.ai. And it's actually a website. It's maybe less positive, but it's actually a database with a lot of examples of incidents. And I think you can learn a lot from those incidents. So it's really like monitoring ethical AI incidents such as the wrong use of deepfakes and so on. Yeah, those two resources are very useful to discover the world of ethical AI.
Great. Well, perhaps I'll get those links from you and put those into the list, the details on the podcast page. I've come to time. I think you've done an excellent job of giving some guidelines here for the listeners. Pauline, thank you very much for your time, and really enjoyed the conversation. How should people get in touch with you? Is perhaps LinkedIn?
Yes, the best way.
Fantastic. Well, that's it. As I said, we've achieved our mission. Thanks again, Pauline, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.